Hello, good day everyone, and welcome back again to Treasury Hub GH. Today we're going to discuss something really important. As you are duly aware, over the period, what we've been trying to do is to make some of these economic indicators very simple and very comprehensible to even the ordinary Ghanaian, right? So today we're going to pick a topical issue which directly affects our pockets, directly affects our disposable income, and it is the concept of inflation and how it's nuanced in Ghana's economy. So we'll just walk through a number of questions over the next 10 to 15 minutes. We'll just walk through a number of questions which will sort of tease out the whole idea and the whole understanding of inflation in Ghana. So let's just jump straight into the meat of the discussion, where we ask ourselves, so what is consumer price index? We're trying to build on something. We're trying to build a point here. Now, this consumer price index just measures the changes in prices, right, of a fixed basket of goods purchased by households. And it's very important we highlight households because there's also producer price index, which measures the changes in prices from the perspective of the producers. This is from the perspective of the consumers. And in Ghana, this is what we rely on to compute our consumer price inflation, which we'll see shortly. Now, how is this data collected in Ghana? Now, we said CPI is an index relating to a fixed basket of goods. So that basket of goods, or those basket of goods, total up to 307 items. Now, this is collected from 57 markets, 8,337 outlets, and on 47,800 unique products. Now, the reference of this price movement changes over a period. Ghana, we've been relying on a 5-year period, but it looks like at the just ended budget and economic statement, government intimated it might reduce this to 5 years. So within this year or next year, we might see the change in the base year or the reference period for inflation. But as we speak, as of today, our base year is 2021. Now, having deduced or having understood what goes into this, let's just bring everything together and discuss what exactly this consumer price inflation is. Now, the index, as we saw above, just measures the changes in the prices, right? Now, if you measure the change in rate, right, the rate at which these prices are moving, then you enter into the terrain of inflation. So there's the index that measures the quantum, and then the movement between those two quantums, which we call the rate of change, or the mathematicians here will say the differential, would amount to inflation, right? So it's just the rate at which prices of goods and services bought by obviously households rise and fall, right? But in a more granular explanation, it is the percentage change. So inflation is in percent, and it is the percentage change in the CPI between two periods. Good. Now let's pick an example, right? We want to pick an example and then see how inflation is computed. Now we want to do a month on month, right? So you have here a month on month. So for, let's say, April 2025, the quantum of index that was collected was 258.6. That was the consumer price index, the quantum. Now, in March, which was the previous month, 2025, the quantum that was collected was this. So what inflation really wants to do is to measure the rate of change between March 2025 and April 2025, and that will give us a month-on-month inflation. So what we simply do is to find the difference between April and March over the March. It's just like you finding percentage change. Now you work out the math, and your result you have is 0.8%. If you want to be very specific, you can put a plus here to bring out the point that it is actually a rise in inflation, right? It's not uncommon for you to have a fall. When that happens, it means that probably the April 2025 figure was less than the prior month, right? So on a month-on-month basis, we can say between March and April, prices rose by 0.8%. Now, this is on a month-on-month basis. Now, let's see how the situation will look like on a year-on-year basis, right? Again, we pick CPI for April 2025, which was 258.6. We pick CPI for April 2024, because remember, we're trying to do a year-on-year change. So 25 versus 24. Again, we work through like we saw up there, find the change, right? The quantum of change over the original. And what we have would be, again, here for emphasis sake, we can put plus here. So what we have here is a positive 21.2%. And in Ghana, inflation is always computed to one decimal place. So very neatly and very briefly, this is how you compute inflation, both on a month-on-month basis and on a year-on-year basis. Right. Now, as we move on, let's look at the various components of our inflation in Ghana. Inflation is very broad, and there are various components or categorizations that are used in some countries. Now, the month-on-month and the year-on-year inflation we have computed, the broad name we give to it is headline inflation. So in Ghana, for headline inflation, we can categorize headline inflation into two forms. We could have food inflation and non-food inflation. So the overall, let's call it the overall 21.2% inflation we have. We could say how much of this is coming from food, how much of this is coming from non-food. And in terms of proportion, non-food contributes a greater percentage to the overall inflation. So what it means is that the items added to non-food are relatively more than the items added to food inflation. So we have non-food inflation contributing 57.3% of the overall headline inflation, and we have food inflation contributing 42.7% of the overall inflation. Again, your overall inflation, you can segregate them into those that are driven by imported goods and those that are driven by goods that are manufactured locally, right? So obviously there will be some bit of FX pressures here, right? And even to some extent they're locally produced if the raw materials are largely imported. Now for locally produced, it contributes a greater chunk, 68.5% of overall inflation, whereas the imported inflation contributes 31.5% of our overall inflation. Now another breakdown the Ghana Statistical Service uses is also to categorize the overall inflation based on the 16 regions. So we can have inflation coming out from the various regions, right? So in Ghana, these are the three main headlines that we pick our inflation from. Now, having said that, let's dovetail into the current inflation data we have, and a bit of color here is inflation in Ghana. As you can see here, is released by the Ghana Statistical Service. They are the body mandated to release inflation, and it comes every month, right? Usually the second week or the second Wednesday of every month, you should expect inflation. There's a whole timetable on the Ghana Statistical Service website. I'd entreat you to have a look, right? But this is the most recent inflation figures we have coming out last week Wednesday for April. So let's just walk through. Now what we see here is the overall year-on-year inflation which we computed. So comparing April 2024 to April 2025, we are saying prices of goods and services purchased rose by 21.2%, right? Now let's compare this to the previous month, which was March, right? Where if you compare March 24 and March 25, prices of goods rose by 22.4. So looking at just inflation for March and inflation for April, yes, goods and services have risen because they are both positive, but the rate at which they rose in April was 21.2, which is much lower than the rate at which they rose in March. Now let's move to our right, where we see inflation segregated into food and non-food, right? So out of the 21.2, food inflation rose by 25% compared to 26.5% the previous month. And again, for April, non-food inflation rose by 17.9 compared to 18.7% the previous month. So if you look at this direction, and you look at this direction as well, the picture it paints is that inflation on a year-on-year basis is falling, right? On a year-on-year basis, food inflation has gone down from 26.5 to 25. Non-food has also gone down from 18.7 to 17.9, and then the overall inflation has also gone down from 22.4 to 21.22. Now let's come to the left, where we segregate them into locally and then imported. For imported, inflation also went down from 18.7 the previous month to 17.7. And again, for locally produced items, it went from 24% to 22.7%. This is how the inflation data looks on a year-on-year basis. Now let's see what happened on a month-on-month basis. So indeed, year-on-year there could be some ease. It doesn't necessarily mean that on a month-on-month the situation will be the same, and we'll see that in a second. So for April 2025, that is between March and April, prices of goods rose by 0.8%. Now this is higher than the rate between February and March, where goods rose by 0.2%. Now if we segregate this inflation into food and non-food, on a month-on-month basis, food inflation rose by 0.9, but the previous month it actually fell by 0.2. So there is some bit of steep pivot in there. Now for the non-food inflation, it remained put. Currently it was 0.7, and previously it was also 0.7. So it looks like the month-on-month pressures and the year-on-year pressures coming through from non-food inflation has actually eased. It's only on the food inflation that we have seen some directional pivot, and that fed through to the overall month-on-month inflation. So guys, thank you very much. We would end here. We hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to drop us any suggestion, anything you want us to discuss. We're more than happy to touch on it, because here our goal is to make everyone understand what or how these macros and what these macros mean. So till we meet again next time, enjoy the rest of your day and catch you next time. Thank you.